Hey guys, tonight we drift away from the familiar highways of history and veer into a salt-slicked shoreline barely remembered by time. You stand on the edge of an ancient sea, the sand soft beneath your feet, the wind carrying a strange blend of brine and jasmine. Seagulls scream overhead, not the lazy kind that snack on fries and modern boardwalks, but scrappy birds that have watched empires fall into the waves. Before you, a mist curls over tidal-pools and barnacled rocks, whispering secrets in a tongue you don't yet understand. You're about to wander into a Korean kingdom you've probably never heard of, one where salt was more valuable than gold, where iron was sacred, and poetry could alter the fate of a city. It thrived quietly between powerhouses like Silla and Beach, and yet it slipped so softly into obscurity that even Korean historians once questioned if it had existed at all. Spoiler, it did. And no, you probably wouldn't have survived there. Not unless you could make salt by hand, recite verses on cue, and win a duel without using a weapon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere unusual, or just proud of your hometown, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love to see where my little nighttime journeys are reaching. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the edge of a peninsula, present-day South Gyeongsang Province, though the name means little in this moment. You're in the era of the Gaia Confederacy, roughly between the 1st and 6th century CE, though good luck pinning down a year. The historians are still arguing over whether the whole thing started in 42 CE with a golden egg in a river, or whether that's just a very poetic way of saying some settlers showed up and got organized. Either way, Gaia, or more accurately, the cluster of mini-kingdoms that formed the Confederation, grew along estuaries and bays where rivers like the Nakdong emptied into the sea. And it did so on the back of something surprisingly mundane: salt. Salt, the white dust of life. You'd better get used to it. Your hands will sting from brine before long. In this kingdom, you won't get far without understanding that salt isn't just a seasoning. It's a currency, a preservative, a healer, and occasionally a murder weapon if thrown into the wrong eyes. The wind from the bay is sharp tonight, carrying hints of kelp and wet wood. In the distance, men and women move between shallow salt pans, scraping the crusts from the surface with long wooden rakes. You join them. The work is steady, slow, and requires patience, like most things in Gaia. The people here don't think in days or months. They think in tides and harvests, in the slow accumulation of salt under the sun. Your feet are bare, and the salt sting between your toes is starting to itch. That's normal. The elders say it's how you know the salt is real. You don't ask what fake salt feels like. You've got other concerns, like the sharp-eyed woman inspecting your baskets. She's one of the salt keepers, and while she doesn't speak much, her ledger is strict. She marks your haul, and if it meets the quota, you get paid in dried anchovies and a poem scratched into silk. Weird combo. Sure, but here, that poem can be traded like cash. And this is where Gaia starts to feel different. Unlike its better-known neighbors, the kingdom didn't just prize military muscle or ornate palaces. Gaia was into vibes. Not in a TikTok way, more like, can you name 5 local plants in a haiku before breakfast sort of way? Literacy here isn't a luxury for elites, it's expected. Even salt workers memorize verses. It's said that during festivals, disputes are settled through poetry battles. Yes, literal duels where the weapon is metaphor and the loser has to clean the fish gutters for a month. One popular verse you overhear goes like this: salt bites the wound, but binds the meat. So too must pain preserve the soul. It's hauntingly beautiful, and also kind of terrifying if you think about it too long. As you finish scraping your portion for the day, you look out at the bay. Fishing boats bob in the current, their sails patched with indigo-dyed cloth. A child runs past you, barefoot and laughing, balancing a clay pot on her head, filled with dried seaweed. She's likely headed home to help prepare jiakol, a fermented fish sauce that's a local delicacy and also smells like something dyed angrily in a jar. Back in your village, Smoke curls from low hearths. People live in half-buried homes here, with thatched roofs and central fire pits. Dogs bark at shadows and cats, always the smug ones, curl atop salt sacks like they own the place. Someone's playing a Gayagem nearby, its delicate plucking notes rising and falling like a lullaby for ghosts. And yet for all its softness, Gaia is no utopia. Power plays out in quiet ways. Salt quotas can mean starvation if missed. Poets wield too much influence, and their rivals sometimes vanish. Usually after a scroll of verse shows up, that's a little too pointed. There are whispers of secret trials, of silencing by song. Historians still argue whether the poets actually held political office or were just elite advisors. Either way, you'd better know your stanzas. You curl up by the fire that night, salt still under your fingernails, and realize something strange. You've barely seen a soldier all day. Not even a watchtower. Not a single spear. It's almost like this place isn't worried about war. But that calm will crack soon enough. For now, sleep settles over the coast, and the wind murmurs ancient lines you half remember, even though you've never heard them before. You wake before sunrise, the air still heavy with ocean damp, and the woven mat beneath you smells faintly of ash and seaweed. A rooster screams somewhere in the mist, either announcing the day or just mad about being awake. You sit up, rubbing the salt from your eyes, and hear a familiar morning sound, the rhythmic thud of poetry being recited under someone's breath. Welcome to the Gaia Confederacy, where even the fishermen warm up their vocal cords with sonnets before casting nets. But which Gaia exactly? That's where things get complicated. You're not in a kingdom so much as a cluster of city-states, 12, to be exact, according to old Chinese records. This loose affiliation is collectively referred to as the Gaia Confederacy, or sometimes the Gerka Kingdom. But no two scholars seem to agree on how it functioned. Was it an alliance of equals? Was there a leader? Historians still argue whether Gaia was truly unified or more like a monthly potluck with too many opinions and one guy who always forgets to bring anything. Today, you head inland, away from the salt flats, following a narrow footpath carved between rice paddies and stone cairns. Your destination, one of the central polities of Gaia, likely Gumguan Gaia, sometimes considered the main one, though don't say that too loudly in Gaia unless you enjoy getting side-eyed at the village bathhouse. Gumguan Gaia's seat is a small city nestled between hills, with low wooden structures and curiously intricate roof lines, roofs that almost seem to mimic the curl of a snail shell. There are no grand palaces here, no golden gates, just wide plazas for public readings, shaded by persimmon trees, and a sprawling open-air market where you can buy dried squid, obsidian combs, or a personalized lament in calligraphy for your next family funeral. The name Gaia itself is whispered, not shouted. It's always our town, the coastal ones, or those cousins upriver. The people identify more with their local leaders, chieftains or elders, than any singular king, which is both charming and, well, political migraine. You can almost hear the sigh of a fictional prime minister trying to get 12 stubborn city-states to agree on what to serve at lunch. Never mind national defense. Still, there's a kind of cohesion, and its glue isn't bloodline, it's culture. Language, ritual, shared myths. One of the most beloved legends is about Queen Hio Huang-Ok, a princess said to have sailed from a distant land, possibly India, to marry King Suro, the mythical founder of Gaia. The story is so detailed it includes her ship's cargo manifest, gold, silver, blue glass beads, and twin stone pagodas. Most historians doubt she was real, but beads from India have been found in Gaia tombs, so who knows? Maybe she was real. Maybe she was a metaphor. Maybe she was both. Historians still argue whether her story is a romantic fable or a record of actual maritime trade, but does speak to Gaia's broader identity. Outward-looking, curious, and not above romanticizing the heck out of its own origin. You reach a small shrine dedicated to her just before noon. It's modest, no incense, no grand altar, just a polished stone and a carved lotus petal where travelers leave tiny offerings. A fish scale, a feather, a folded verse. You leave a salted plum and step back, unsure if you're honoring a queen, a ghost, or a really persistent piece of national branding. Locals pass by in loose linen tunics, offering you polite nods. One woman carries a clay jug stamped with a design you don't recognize. 2 cranes circling a mountain. She catches your gaze and smiles. "Buy in hand," she asks gently. You nod, though you're not entirely sure what she means. Buy in hand was the earlier confederation, the one Gaia sort of grew out of like particularly artsy teenager. Records from the Chinese and Guizhi mention Buy in hand as a trade-savvy coastal cluster of chiefdoms rich in salt, iron, and, curiously, poetry. So yes, even their ancestors were salty lyricists. The people here speak in layered dialects. You begin to notice it. How a common word for river might shift slightly from village to village, or how proverbs can be weaponized depending on intonation. It's possible you've just been insulted 3 times in the past hour and didn't even realize it. One old man mutters something about too much ink, not enough fish, which feels personal. Still, they accept you, curiously, cautiously. You're invited to dinner, where fermented beans bubble in a clay pot, and someone reads aloud from a newly composed epic about a lost sword and a talking turtle. You eat slowly, trying not to grimace at the sour tang of the side dishes. Someone pours rice wine into your cup and recites, "In the house of salt, even the tongue must brine itself." You laugh politely. Everyone nods as if this is the height of wit. Maybe it is. You're starting to get the rhythm now. As night falls, the central plaza fills with music and murmured recitations. Children sit cross-legged, mimicking adult voices. A blind woman sings a ballad about a deer that fell in love with a fisherman. It ends badly for the deer. You're not sure what the moral is. Before bed, you stare up at the stars. There's no royal standard fluttering overhead. No official language, no uniform. But still, Gaia moves as one. Not through laws, through stories, through salt and silence, and the careful way people remember a name without saying it too loudly. And that might just be enough. You wake up on a mat that smells faintly of fish oil and rice straw, your neck stiff and your ears still echoing with last night's poetry contest, which, yes, ended in someone dramatically flinging a gourd of millet wine at the ground in protest of a poorly rhymed couplet. The vibe here is high drama, low casualties, which, all things considered, is a pretty good way to run a civilization. Today, you're traveling to one of the beating hearts of this loose confederation, the port city of Aragaya. It's a few days' journey from Gumguan, and your route weaves through dense forests, riverside fords, and sun-bleached valleys, where wild pears grow in squat, gnarled trees. The path is well worn, not from war, but trade. Gaia was not a kingdom of conquerors. It was a kingdom of sellers. And what they sold, more than anything else, was salt. You approach the edge of a vast tidal marsh near the mouth of the Nakdong River. Wooden salt pans stretch toward the sea like a checkerboard, scorched by sun and time. The workers here are tan and sharp-eyed, dressed in short hemp tunics and broad straw hats that resemble overturned bowls. They move in silence, save for the rhythmic splash of their long-handled scrapers. Salt isn't just harvested, it's curated. You watch as one man tests a pan's crystallization by dragging a feather across it. Another woman lifts a brine sample to the sun, inspecting the clarity as if checking for spirits. Salt of this quality is used not just for food, but for preservation, healing, and ritual. It's said Gaia salt could purify poisoned wells and keep fish edible for months. One tale even insists that a properly blessed salt brick could exorcise stubborn ghosts. Though to be fair, no one seems eager to test that. This industry wasn't a side hustle. It was infrastructure. Entire villages, known as Salmon, formed around salt production. There were salt guilds, salt taxes, even salt feasts. Seasonal festivals where the best briners were crowned with garlands of kelp and given jars of pickled plums as trophies. If you're wondering whether those titles held any social clout, the answer is definitely. At least one known marriage proposal was sealed with the perfectly shaped salt crystal. Romantic? Questionable. Crunchy? Absolutely. A courier trots past you on a wiry brown pony, carrying a scroll tube sealed with a fish scale emblem. You ask someone what it is. Trade route confirmation. They shrug. Probably for a salt shipment to Silla or Beach, or maybe even Japan. Gaia's salt didn't just season its own rice bowls. It was exported across the Korean peninsula and overseas. Maritime records, scattered and unreliable, but occasionally tantalizing, suggest that Gaia maintained semi-regular exchanges with the Yamato Kingdom of Japan. Clay vessels marked with Gaia symbols have been found in ancient Japanese burial mounds. Some scholars even suggest that certain Japanese poetic forms were influenced by Gaia verse traditions, though of course, historians still argue whether this was cultural exchange or just parallel evolution. But it's not just salt that sails from these shores. You walk past docks where crates of iron goods are being loaded onto flat-bottom boats. The iron trade was Gaia's other claim to fame, and together with salt, it formed the Confederacy's economic backbone. Iron was exported raw, smelted, and forged into tools, weapons, farming implements, and ceremonial items. But that's a story for another day. Today belongs to salt. You're invited to stay the night in a coastal hamlet. The saltmaster's home is simple but welcoming. Woven mats cover the floor, and wind chimes made from oyster shells clatter gently near the eaves. Over dinner, grilled eel and salty seaweed soup, the old saltmaster tells you a strange story. Once, poet insulted a salt baron, he says, sipping his fermented barley drink. Said his brine was shallow and his verses shallower. The baron challenged him, not to a duel, but to a salt-off. You raise an eyebrow. A salt-off. The man nods solemnly. 3 days. 2 pans. 1 moon. The baron's salt sparkled like glass, but the poet's? Oz had a sheen, like silver rain. He won, and the baron had to name a fish sauce after him. Very good with duck. You laugh, but no one else does. Apparently, the story's sacred. You offer a sheepish apology and accept another helping of the now iconic poet sauce. Later that evening, you sit outside, watching as workers haul sacks of dried salt inland. Some are destined for trade. Others will be used in Gaia's intricate rituals, especially funerals, where the dead are bathed in salt water before being placed in clay coffins. It's a kind of spiritual armor, keeping their bodies safe on the journey to the afterlife. Salt is everywhere here, on skin, in language beneath fingernails. Children learn to write their names in salt before they ever touch ink. Lovers gift each other salt jars, painted with tiny verses. One local saying goes, "Love without salt is just thirst." By now, your lips are dry and your feet are cracked, but you understand something essential. This kingdom's strength isn't in its armies or monuments. It's in the things that seem too small to notice. The grain, the rhyme, the ritual. As you curl beneath a reed-woven blanket, a lullaby echoes from a nearby home. It's soft and low, and if you listen closely, you can just make out the words. The sea gives salt, the heart gives song, and both are lost if carried too long. Sleep takes you, and even in your dreams, your hands are slick with brine. You wake with your mouth tasting like a sea breeze, salt, sun, and something faintly metallic. The blanket clings to your skin, stiff with dried brine, and for a second you wonder if you've become part of the salt pans themselves. But no, you're still you, still blinking at the misted window of the saltmaster's home, still in Gaia, a place where poetry walks taller than power, and everyone carries a little verse in their pocket, just in case. Today, you're heading inland again, to a settlement where things work a little differently. No salt pans here, no fish nets. Instead, a walled courtyard hums with the low music of brushstrokes and murmured phrases. This is one of Gaia's schools of poetry. Not a school in the strict sense, but more of a community space where anyone from farmers to fishmongers can learn the fine art of structured verse. You arrive just in time for the morning weighing of words. A young girl, no older than 10, steps onto a smooth stone platform and recites a 3-line poem about wind through pine needles. The elders nod sagely. One of them mutters, "She's almost ready for fish tax negotiations." You blink. Apparently, Poetic skill is an acceptable credential for municipal bargaining here. In Gaia, poetry isn't just art, it's infrastructure. Here's how it works. Leaders are chosen not by birthright or brute strength, but by their eloquence. If you can't settle a land dispute with a sonnet that makes a grown man weep, you probably aren't fit for office. It sounds like a joke, until you realize how well it works. With no central monarch and no single army, Gaia relies on cultural cohesion, and the glue is verse. You're invited to a public arbitration in the town square. Two farmers are locked in a bitter dispute over a shared irrigation channel. The judge, a stern woman with eyebrows like storm clouds, listens patiently to both sides, then instructs them to respond with seijo, a form of Korean verse with a strict structure and sharp wit. Farmer 1. The water knows no master, yet you would leash the stream with words. Dig your own well, if thirst blind your ears. Farmer 2. Not to be outdone. The land is not a mirror. It remembers who feeds its roots. Call the crows. They know where rain once fell. The crowd gasps. Someone drops a gourd. The judge leans back, strokes her chin, and declares Farmer 2 the victor, citing superior metaphor density. The irrigation remains shared, but the loser must host the next harvest feast. You can't help but marvel at how this works. No weapons drawn, no shouting, just a well-aimed couplet and community consensus on metaphor strength. Historians still argue whether this system had any real legal structure, or if it was just cultural etiquette elevated to the level of law. But the result is undeniable. For centuries, Gaia maintained relative internal peace without ever crowning a single unifying monarch. You're taken next to a scriptorium of sorts, a long hall open to the elements, where scribes work on rice paper with brushes so fine they look like they were plucked from a sleeping crane. Verses are copied, analyzed, preserved. But this isn't just idle transcription. Every poem has a job: to record events, encode laws, even deliver taxes. Some of the earliest known Gaia documents were essentially poetic receipts. Imagine explaining that to your accountant. One scribe hands you a scroll. It's a love letter, composed by a trader heading to Japan. It reads, "Your eyes are iron stars. They forge heat from across the sea. Wait for me where salt meets plum." You ask what happened to him. The scribe shrugs. Probably forgot her name halfway to Kyushu. A good poem, though. That's the thing in Gaia. Memory is imperfect. Records are fragile. But poetry lasts. It's portable, repeatable, whispered across generations, even when names fade and cities sink into silt. That's why, even now, fragments of Gaia verse survive in regional folk songs. You might hear one at a wedding in Gimhe, or muttered by an old woman stirring fish paste in a Giala province kitchen. Of course, it wasn't all harmony and haiku. Gaia's poetic society had its shadows. There were accusations of verse manipulation, editing documents post factum to favor one clan over another. Slander by poem was a thing. There's even a legend about a woman who cursed a rival lover through a lullaby, and supposedly every child who heard it grew up hating chestnuts. Chestnuts, for some reason, were metaphorically tied to infidelity. Still unclear why. That night, there's a public recital in the village square. Bonfires crackle. Children dart between dancers. Elders sip wine from carved gourd flasks. And in the center, a poet stands to recite a new work, a bold piece about the sea swallowing pride and the moon judging silently from above. The crowd falls quiet. The poet finishes, bows, and walks away barefoot. You realize no one claps here. Applause isn't the point. Silence is. As you lie down under a bamboo eave, you catch a final whisper of verse from a nearby storyteller. We built no throne. We carved no crown. But we wrote our names in salt and sound. You fall asleep with that line echoing behind your eyes, feeling like you've just walked through a dream composed in ink. Dawn pulls you from sleep with the hiss of boiling water and the earthy scent of roasted barley tea. You sit up slowly, watching steam curl above a fire pit where two women are already preparing breakfast: fermented vegetables, a few dried anchovies, and thin slices of rice cake wrapped in kelp. The village is quiet, still drowsy with yesterday's verses. Today, though, you're leaving poetry behind, at least temporarily, and stepping into stone, bone, and dust. You're heading to one of the places that wasn't supposed to exist, a Gaia tomb. For centuries, the academic consensus was murky at best. Gaia had left almost no grand architecture, no palaces, no towering statues, and so, for generations, historians assumed it was little more than a loose alliance of minor settlements. Culturally interesting, sure, but politically negligible. Then someone opened the ground. It started in the 1990s, not far from Gimme, with a construction project that unearthed a mound that looked suspiciously artificial. Inside it, buried beneath layers of carefully packed earth and stone, was a chamber, a rectangular space, just large enough to lie down in, if you weren't afraid of spirits or centuries-old curses. Inside, bronze, iron, and jade, a wooden coffin, crumbled like dried leaves, and resting near the head of the skeleton, a gilded crown. That's when the scholars started arguing again. Was this really Gaia? Could a confederation with no king have tombs this elaborate? And if so, how many more had been lost to time, tilled under rice paddies or stolen by looters before anyone thought to look? You arrive at one of the reconstructed burial mounds mid-morning. It rises from the field like a sleeping beast, low and wide, covered in short grass. A guide nods solemnly and gestures for you to follow a narrow wooden path that leads down into a gently sloped tunnel. It's cool inside, the air thick with ancient damp and something faintly metallic. You move slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the dim torchlight. The walls are lined with stone slabs, their surfaces smooth and almost humming with silence. And then, you step into the burial chamber. The central coffin is long gone, eaten by centuries of rot. But what remains is astonishing. Clay vessels lined with residue of fermented sauces, lacquered wooden combs, iron arrowheads, and ornate belt buckles carved with spiral patterns. Near the far wall rests a crown, a fragile diadem of gold and bronze, its points styled like flames or feathers, depending on who you ask. There's no name, no inscription, just the unmistakable aura of reverence. You ask the guide whose tomb this was. He shrugs. Could have been a poet king, or a salt chieftain, or both. Titles don't mean much when you're dust. Outside, the air feels sharper somehow, as if it's trying to scrape away the centuries that clung to your clothes inside the tomb. You sit beneath a pine tree, eating a lunch of sticky rice and pickled radish, listening to birds argue overhead, and you think, this kingdom didn't need pyramids or emperors. Its monuments were smaller, closer to the earth, harder to find, but no less significant. The grave goods aren't just offerings, they're breadcrumbs. Each item tells you something about how the Gaia lived, what they valued, who they honored. There are the expected things, iron tools, beads, the occasional spearhead. But then there are the anomalies. One tomb held a set of musical stones, flat slabs that chime when struck. Another revealed the remains of a dog buried in its own tiny coffin, wrapped in fabric. And still another held glass beads clearly imported from as far as the Roman Empire. Yes, you heard that right. Glass beads, Roman in origin, lying beside the bones of a Gaian noble who likely never left the peninsula. Historians still argue whether the beads came directly through long trade routes or were passed through intermediary kingdoms, but either way, it means Gaia was connected to the world in ways we still don't fully understand. You climb another burial mound in the afternoon, this one overlooking the Nakdong River. It's smaller, less intact, but the view is stunning. You can see the sweep of the valley, dotted with rice fields and thatched homes. Wind rustles the grass, and the smell of salt water lingers, even this far inland. And then something curious happens. A group of children appear, led by an elderly woman carrying a drum made from stretched fish skin. She settles at the base of the mound and begins to sing. Not loud, not theatrical, just a soft, repetitive chant like a lullaby. The kids join in, humming along. You can't understand the words, but the tone is unmistakably one of remembering. You ask her afterward what the song was. It's for the sleepers, she says, the ones who wrote nothing down. We sing so they're not forgotten. It hits you then. Gaia wasn't lost because it failed. It was forgotten because it didn't shout. It didn't build walls tall enough to outlast invaders. It didn't stamp its name across stone or declare itself supreme. It sang. It salted. It spoke in measured verse and trusted memory to do the rest. Not a great long-term archival strategy, you'll admit, but it has a kind of quiet dignity. As the sun dips below the hills, you head back toward the village, your shoes thick with mud and your thoughts heavier than usual. You've walked through a tomb that wasn't supposed to exist, seen relics of a people who weren't supposed to matter, and now their story sticks to you like salt on skin. You lie down that night on a mat beside the fire, and sleep comes slowly, drifting patient, like silt settling at the bottom of an old, forgotten river. You wake before dawn, the horizon just a smudge of pale gold. A rooster calls out again, though this one sounds more like it's being strangled by ambition, and you stretch slowly, every muscle stiff from the uneven bedding and yesterday's long walk through the mounds of the dead. Your host hands you a cup of barley tea with a solemn nod, and you sip it slowly as the morning mist pulls back from the rooftops like a stage curtain. Today, you're following the routes of ink and iron, paths carved by trade, marriage, and sheer poetic diplomacy. Gaia didn't grow through conquest. It grew through connection, and its partners weren't just local. You set out with a trade envoy, a small group traveling upriver with cargo strapped to short-legged oxen. They're transporting something simple but prized. Iron ingots wrapped in straw and sealed with clay stamps. These weren't just for tools. They were gifts, offerings, sometimes even dowry components. In Gaia, giving someone iron was like giving them an engagement ring, a retirement bonus, and a threat, all in one tidy package. The envoy's leader is a woman named Yun, stern but surprisingly funny. She offers you dried pear slices as you walk, and recounts an old joke about a failed marriage between a beach princess and a Gaia blacksmith that ended when he wrote her a love poem comparing her to rust. Never compare your lover to oxidation, Yun advises, chewing thoughtfully, especially if her kingdom makes better swords than yours. The road rises, then dips through thick forest and wide-open farmland, until you reach a rest stop where stones bear the faint remnants of carved characters, markers that once designated boundaries or trading checkpoints. You trace a finger across one. The letters are Korean, but older, looser, almost like they're stretching into something else. Old script, Yun says. Some say it's from before the Three Kingdoms really solidified. Others think it's made up. Historians still argue whether Gaia had a unified writing system or simply borrowed heavily from Chinese script, with local variations sprinkled in like seasoning. The truth is slippery. Some burial sites contain Chinese-style inscriptions. Others hold pottery etched with characters no one can definitively identify. But the messages were clear enough for trade. You arrive at a bustling market outpost where Gaia traders exchange iron, salt, dried fish, lacquerware, and even poetry scrolls. In return, they receive cotton, ceramics, and beads, some from as far as China and Japan. A man shows you a piece of colored glass no bigger than a fingernail and swears it came from a shipwreck off the Ryukyu Islands. Whether it did or didn't, you buy it anyway. It hums slightly in your palm. A tiny time capsule. The market smells of fish oil and spices. Children chase each other between baskets of garlic and radish. A storyteller, probably unpaid, shouts over the din, spinning a tale about a Gaia ambassador who once convinced a Silla governor to forgive a tax debt by composing a drinking song so good it made the man weep. The story is clearly exaggerated. The details are inconsistent. And yet you believe it, because that's how things worked here. Gaia's diplomacy wasn't built on treaties carved in stone or intimidating armies. It was built on shared meals, ritual exchange, and intermarriage. Royal families across the region, especially between Gaia and the early Yamato rulers of Japan, intertwined their bloodlines like ivy across a trellis. One legend tells of a Gaia prince sent to marry Yamato noblewoman. He supposedly took with him scrolls of verse, iron swords, and jars of salted plum wine. his descendants became part of the imperial lineage. That's the story anyway. You sit down with an elder at the edge of the marketplace. He's hunched and wrapped in layers of hemp fabric dyed a deep ochre. His voice is thin but warm. Trade is breath. He tells you, we spoke with salt. We sang with swords. We sent children across the sea so our stories could ride their backs. He shows you a small wooden box wrapped in black silk. Inside is a necklace, glass beads, faded but intact, and a tiny iron pendant in the shape of a crescent moon. For my daughter, he says. She was taken to Japan many years ago. Married a merchant. I send her poems in every shipment. You ask if she replies. Sometimes, he smiles. But she writes in Japanese now. I have to translate my own blood. That hits harder than you expect. The sun is lowering by the time you prepare to return, shadows lengthening across the trail. You realize you haven't seen a single border guard all day. No swords, no toll gates, just a slow movement of people, goods, and ideas. In many ancient societies, diplomacy was a luxury. In Gaia, it was a survival strategy. With larger kingdoms like Scylla and Beach breathing down its neck, Gaia played the long game. They sent gifts instead of threats, songs instead of soldiers. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes you arrived back at your host's village late in the evening, greeted by a warm bowl of anchovy stew and a fire just starting to crackle. Someone's reciting a new poem about a gull who falls in love with the fisherman's reflection. You only catch the end. He cast no net, and yet I drowned, not in sea, but silver lies. You lie back against the wooden frame of the house, the night air brushing your face like a familiar hand. Somewhere across the sea, someone else is probably reading a poem just like it. Maybe your blood is in both places now. And isn't that what Gaia wanted all along? Your legs ache as you climb yet another hill, this one dotted with small forges belching black smoke into the sky. The air smells of charcoal and damp earth, and each clang of hammer on metal rings through the mist like a bell calling spirits to dinner. You've left behind the soft world of salt and verse for something hotter, rougher, and louder. This is Gaia's other great heartbeat, Iron. You arrive just as the blacksmiths are beginning their morning rhythm. Fires roar in bell-shaped furnaces, and apprentices pump leather bellows in a steady, practiced pace. Sparks dance from anvils, and the ring of metal on metal echoes like thunder over the valley. No poetic metaphors here, just soot, sweat, and steel. The Gaia Confederacy may be known for its love of poetry, but it earned much of its actual survival and its relevance through ironwork. These hills are rich in ore, and the Gaia people learned early how to dig it, smelt it, shape it, and sell it. And not just crude plows or dull knives. These smiths produced fine weaponry, farming tools, ceremonial items, and most famously, curved swords so well balanced that some were said to sing when swung. Okay, maybe just a little poetry. You sit beside one forge as a young smith demonstrates his process. He shows you how iron sand is mixed with pine charcoal and clay crucibles, then heated in stone furnaces for days. The result is bloom iron, a spongy, inconsistent mass that has to be hammered into something usable. No shortcuts, no cheap tricks. He grins as he says this, face streaked with ash. Even the blade's soul needs beating before it's sharp. You nod, both impressed and slightly afraid of him. This craftsmanship wasn't limited to weapons. Gaia's iron was used to create farming tools, sickles, hoes, scythes, that made its agriculture more productive than its neighbors. With surplus grain and fish preserved by that ever-present salt, Gaia had the economic cushion to invest in things other kingdoms might not prioritize: art, literacy, trade, and peacekeeping. Still, iron brought more than prosperity. It brought attention, especially from the Scylla kingdom to the east, who had their own blacksmiths, but lacked Gaia's abundant ore and refining methods. Beach, too, cast long glances toward Gaia's iron fields. Some Gaia chieftains leaned into this interest, forming temporary trade alliances, exchanging royal gifts, and marrying off their daughters with dowries that sparkled like sword hilts in sunlight. One well-known tale, half history, half epic, tells of a Gaia blacksmith named Mugo, who was so skilled that he forged a blade light enough to cut air but strong enough to split armor. The king of Scylla, hearing of this, invited Mugo to defect, offering land, titles, and a personal harem. Mugo refused. In response, the Scylla king wrote him a poem. Mugo then fled to Japan, where he allegedly became a demigod of sword craft. Whether or not he existed, his story is whispered around forges to this day. You take a break from the heat in a nearby hall used for showcasing ceremonial ironwork. Here, iron isn't practical, it's theatrical. Diadems shaped like birds in flight. Breastplates etched with rivers and wind. Even mirrors, fragile. Rounded ones with iron frames and polished bronze surfaces, meant to reflect not just your face, but your character. You lean over one, catch your own eyes in the warped bronze. For a moment, you look like someone else entirely, older, maybe wiser, definitely grimier. That afternoon, you're invited to observe a ritual blade forging. The master smith is an older man with a limp and a streak of red ink on his thumb from writing out the blade's name earlier that morning. Yes, the blade is named before it's forged. It's considered bad luck otherwise. This one will be called Silent River, and its purpose isn't combat. It's ceremonial, meant to be buried with a clan elder who passed last winter. The forging takes hours. The heat is overwhelming, but the mood is reverent, almost holy. The master smith speaks few words, but each movement is exact, like choreography passed down through generations. Each hammer strike, he murmurs, reminds the iron who it is. You wonder if that applies to people too. Historians still argue whether Gaia's iron trade was centralized or scattered among autonomous clans. Some argue for an organized guild-like structure. Others think each community had its own traditions, loosely connected through trade. The evidence, scattered across burial sites and ruined workshops, remains inconclusive. But one thing is certain: Gaia iron traveled. Swords marked with distinctive Gaia patterns have been found in Japanese tombs, particularly among the Kofun elite. These weren't war trophies, they were gifts, tokens of allegiance. Some even had inscriptions invoking shared ancestors or blessings of peace. That's how Gaia maintained its web, with salt, yes. With poetry, certainly, but also with cold, hard iron, shaped by fire and wielded not to conquer, but to connect. As night falls, the forge is dim, and workers gather around pots of warm broth and grilled river fish. They sing softly, nothing fancy, just simple work songs passed from parent to child. One apprentice leans over and whispers a riddle in your ear. What is harder than iron, melts faster than ice, and leaves deeper wounds than any blade? You think. Time, you guess. She smiles. A badly written poem. Okay, fair. You curl up near the now-cold forge. The stone floor still warm beneath your mat. You dream of hammers and bells, of sparks flying like fireflies, and of a world held together by metal and metaphor. The sun breaks through a soft ocean haze as you find yourself walking down a quiet footpath toward a cluster of stone mounds nestled at the edge of a gentle hillside. The grass is damp from morning dew, and your sandals sink slightly into the loamy soil. Everything smells of river mist and wild mint. And yet, there's something eerie in the stillness here. You've come to one of Gaia's ancient burial grounds. Unlike the towering pyramid tombs of Egyptian pharaohs or the stone giants of Easter Island, these mounds are unassuming, humble even. But don't be fooled. Beneath each grass-covered dome lies a story, sometimes peaceful, sometimes grim, and often a mix of both. Your guide today is a soft-spoken caretaker who's been tending these tombs for over 30 years. He waves you toward a particularly squat mound, surrounded by small marker stones. Infant burial, he explains. One of many. This is your first encounter with what scholars call jar burials, a funerary custom where the bodies of infants and small children were placed inside large clay jars and then buried, often near settlements or under house floors. The belief was simple. Young lives deserved to remain close to the warmth of the hearth, even after death. As tragic as that sounds, there's something heartbreakingly tender about it too. You step carefully, following the caretaker's lead as he kneels beside a dug-out replica. Inside is a lidded jar the size of a basket, sealed with clay and decorated with simple red lines. Not elaborate, but made with clear intention. He places a palm over the lid and closes his eyes. Some call it primitive, he says, but there's more love in that jar than in most palaces. Moving on, you approach a much larger burial mound. This one built for a clan leader from the 5th century. Here, the contents grow stranger. Excavations have revealed items placed not only for honor, but for company. Jewelry, weapons, hair combs, wine jugs, and in a few controversial cases, other human remains, suggesting the possibility of accompanying sacrifices. This is where things get uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether Gaia practiced ritual human sacrifice. Some tombs show signs that servants or concubines may have been buried alive with their masters, a grim send-off into the next world. But others counter that these remains could belong to later interments or symbolic placements. There's no definitive proof, only layered bones and the quiet terror of uncertainty. Either way, you feel a chill in the air, and not from weather. What's not debated, however, is the wealth packed into these tombs. One famous excavation unearthed a woman buried with over 300 glass beads, 2 mirrors, and an iron dagger shaped like a crane's beak. Another included bronze drums, lacquered boxes, and imported goods from as far away as the Japanese archipelago. That tells you 2 things. Gaia's elite had serious trade connections and a flair for the dramatic. But not every grave belonged to the rich. You pass by a field of smaller burial pits, marked only by stones and rusted fragments of farming tools. Here lie fishermen, herders, salt workers, and blacksmith's apprentices, each one an invisible thread in the kingdom's larger story. You kneel beside one grave where archaeologists found a child holding a small iron toy, half sword, half spoon, probably made by a parent in a moment of love, now oxidized into a ghost of playtime. It's quiet here, yet not lonely. Even now, wildflowers bloom atop the mounds, as if drawn to the presence of lives once lived fully and fiercely. In one of the most unique finds to date, a burial from the southern coast included a series of inscribed tiles, not religious texts, not commands, but poems, short, strange, haunting. Beneath salt sky, I slept in mist. Iron sang me dreams. Now silence is my poem. Experts still debate whether this was a personal message from the deceased or something placed by the living. Either way, it's beautiful and a little unsettling. You whisper it aloud once, just to hear how it sounds in the air. The caretaker raises an eyebrow. Some say that poem was written by the dead. He chuckles, but only if you read it backward under moonlight. You can't tell if he's joking. One final stop. A newly excavated burial site on a riverbank not far from the salt flats. This tomb, unlike the others, is hexagonal, unusual for Gaia. Inside, alongside the usual grave goods, archaeologists discovered a set of bronze wind chimes strung together with red silk threads. When the wind picks up, the chimes still make a faint, silvery hum. You sit for a while and listen. It's not music, not exactly, but it's something close. The caretaker swears the tone changes with the season, like the dead still have opinions about the weather. Later, you help him tidy up offerings left by local visitors, sweet rice cakes, folded paper cranes, incense sticks already spent. He lets you keep one of the tiny charms, a miniature jar made of fired clay, no bigger than your thumb. For dreams, he says, or salt, whichever you need more. As dusk falls and the tombs fade into shadow, you realize something unexpected. This kingdom, once considered forgettable, left behind more than relics. It left echoes, and not loud ones, quiet ones, the kind you only hear when you stop talking long enough to listen. You walk back toward the sea, eyes adjusting to the gold-tinged horizon, and it hits you. You've been wandering a kingdom with no king. Strange, right? Kingdoms usually revolve around some crowned figure, a bejeweled warlord, a robe-draped monarch, or a slightly sinister teenage prince who makes everyone nervous. But in Gaia, there's no singular throne to bow to. No royal lineage stretching back to a divine tiger or a celestial egg. Just councils, clans, and shifting alliances held together by salt, iron, and poetry. This wasn't an accident. It was a design. Gaia, or more specifically the Gaia Confederacy, wasn't one unified kingdom like Scylla or Beach. It was a loose network of small polities, about 6 major ones, with the most prominent being Gumguan Gaia. Each one had its own local leader, often called Chechong or Gan, but there was no centralized, all-powerful ruler lording over them all. Think of it more like a band of siblings sharing a house. They might fight over who gets the bigger room, but they'll still team up if someone tries to steal the rice pot. Historians still argue whether this structure was a strength or a fatal flaw. On the one hand, it gave the Gaia people resilience. Local autonomy meant faster responses to problems, less dependency on a single ruler's mood swings, and more room for cultural experimentation. On the other hand, it made them vulnerable to the more cohesive and expansionist powers around them, like Scylla to the east or Beach to the west. When push came to shove, Gaia's fragmented voice often got drowned out by bigger, louder neighbors. The absence of a central king didn't mean a lack of ceremony, though. You soon find yourself seated in an open-air meeting space, more like a stone amphitheater carved into the hillside than a palace throne room. This is where the Council of Iron used to gather, or at least that's what local oral traditions claim. There's no solid archaeological proof, just a suspiciously symmetrical circle of seats and a large, flat central slab that might have served as a platform for speakers or dramatic poetry readings. Possibly both. You imagine the scene. Representatives from different Gaia polities gathering under the moonlight, drinking fermented rice wine, trading gossip, and negotiating trade routes or marriage alliances. There are arguments, naturally. Someone probably storms off every few weeks. But then someone recites a particularly biting haiku, and suddenly everyone's back to laughing again. A government held together not by armies, but by rhymes. That's not just wishful thinking, by the way. Poetry wasn't some idle hobby here. It functioned as diplomatic currency. If you wanted to make an official complaint to another polity, you'd send a verse. If you wanted to propose a political union, you wrote a poem. The idea was simple. Anyone could shout. But only someone wise could sing. And heaven help you if you sent a poorly worded couplet. This emphasis on poetic diplomacy meant that Gaia's leaders, though not kings, often doubled as artists, teachers, or philosophers. One particularly famous tale involves a chieftain named Sam, who once settled a decades-long border dispute not with a treaty, but with a traveling performance troupe that reenacted the conflict in pantomime, complete with interpretive dance. Scylla, naturally, found this absurd, but the people of Gaia, they loved it. Historians still argue whether Sam actually existed or whether he's a folkloric composite. But his story survives, passed down in fireside tales and written on the margins of rice paper scrolls. There were attempts, of course, to unify Gaia under a single ruler, especially in its later years, when Scylla's shadow began creeping westward. A charismatic leader named King Suaro, often considered the mythical founder of Gumguan Gaia, is said to have emerged from a golden egg, because why not? Legend has it that Suaro had 9 younger brothers, all of whom bowed to his leadership, though conveniently, none of them seem to leave any trace in the archaeological record. Suaro is also credited with marrying a princess from the Indian kingdom of Ayodhya, named Hio Huang-oke, who supposedly traveled by boat across the ocean, bringing silk, jewels, and probably a wicked case of jet lag. Modern scholars remain deeply skeptical about this tale, citing a lack of maritime evidence and the suspiciously romantic tone of the story. Still, local temples dedicated to Queen Hio exist today, and people still claim descent from her lineage, because who wouldn't want to say their family tree includes a globetrotting royal from the subcontinent? Even if Suaro did exist, it's clear that his rule didn't extend far beyond his immediate domain. The other Gaia polities continued doing their own thing, cooperating when convenient, drifting apart when not. So, why didn't Gaia ever centralize? Was it stubborn independence? Or did they just really hate committee meetings? One theory points to the geography. Gaia's terrain is carved with rivers, bays, and narrow mountain passes, perfect for decentralization. Trade routes were easier to manage locally, and the abundance of coastal resources gave each region enough wealth to sustain itself. Salt flats here, iron mines there, pottery workshops scattered throughout. No single polity could monopolize the kingdom's lifeblood. They needed each other, but only just enough. As the wind picks up, you turn your eyes inland, toward the distant hills where rival kingdoms once built their watchtowers. You wonder, if Gaia had crowned a single king, would history have remembered them differently? Or would they have lost the very thing that made them Gaia? No palaces remain, no thrones, but underfoot, you feel the crunch of shell middens, broken ceramic shards, and sea-worn pebbles that were once traded like currency. It's not emptiness. It's echo. The echo of a people who ruled without a king, who traded more poems than proclamations, and who believed that leadership didn't always need a crown. You smile. The wind smells like salt again. You sit now on the worn edge of a stone terrace, weeds creeping through its cracks. Once a meeting spot, now a silent perch. You look east. There, across low hills and a winding river, rises a different kind of kingdom, Scylla. It's easy to forget how close Gaia and Scylla once were. Neighbors, yes, but also rivals. And slowly, very slowly, that rivalry shifted from uneasy coexistence to an unstoppable pressure, like tectonic plates groaning toward collision. Scylla didn't rise overnight. For centuries, it was just another city-state, like Gaia, like Beach, scrabbling for influence. But where Gaia leaned into decentralization and salt trade diplomacy, Scylla centralized. Hard, strong kings, tight control, rigid hierarchy, and, as you begin to realize, a talent for turning relationships into leverage. You pass a stream that glitters in the fading light. Insects hum. Somewhere nearby, a stone stele lies half buried, its inscription worn nearly smooth. You think about the old phrase passed between Gaia traders: dance lightly, for Scylla watches. It's not paranoia if they really are watching. Scylla's growth wasn't just territorial. It was cultural and spiritual. Around the 4th century, they began leaning heavily into Buddhism, which Gaia didn't fully adopt until much later. Scylla monks traveled to China, studied under Tang masters, and returned with scrolls, statues, and diplomatic connections. Gaia, by contrast, still balanced animist practices, ancestor worship, and the poetic traditions rooted in older tribal belief systems. There's something beautiful about that, and also something dangerous. Historians still argue whether Gaia resisted Buddhism out of cultural pride, political disinterest, or sheer timing. But whatever the reason, it created a growing ideological rift between the kingdoms. Scylla had temples, Gaia had shrines. Scylla had court records, Gaia had verses passed through memory. One looked to the heavens for order, the other trusted the tide. You trek along the remains of an ancient trade route, now little more than a game trail. But once it hummed with the footsteps of oxen and peddlers carrying salt, ironware, and silk. Gaia depended on these trade networks for survival, weaving through the crags and rivers, linking not just its internal polities, but also Japanese settlements, beach courts, and even Chinese ports. And Scylla wanted control of all of it. Their method? Not always brute force. First came soft incursions, trade agreements with unfair terms, intermarriage designed to bind noble houses, and emissaries with long smiles and short patience. Then, as the 5th century rolled in like a tide, came the armies. Not large-scale invasions, not yet, just probes, little territorial adjustments. A border village swallowed here, a fort repurposed there. Gaia responded, but inconsistently. Some polities rallied, others hesitated, and a few quietly made deals with Scylla behind closed bamboo doors. One particularly awkward incident involved the Gaia polity, who allegedly offered to join Scylla entirely in exchange for military protection, only to have the envoy arrested by his own people for lacking poetic license. Yes, apparently, even diplomatic betrayal needed to be well written in Gaia. The story could be apocryphal, but it says something about the culture. Words mattered more than weapons, which worked fine until it didn't. By the late 5th century, Gaia was dancing in Scylla's shadow. You stumble upon the ruins of what might have once been a fortress. It's humble. Nothing like the grand mountain citadels of Goguryeo or Scylla. Just low walls, some earthen mounds, a ditch choked with moss. Maybe it wasn't meant for war. Maybe it was a lookout. A last attempt to organize. A whisper into the storm. That storm had a name. King Jaijung of Scylla. Under his rule, Scylla consolidated power and began tightening its grip on the Nakdong River basin, Gaia's economic heart. Salt routes, cut, iron shipments, seized, poetry, laughed at. Well, not quite. Even Scylla's chroniclers begrudgingly acknowledged Gaia's literary elegance. One later account noted, their verses were woven as silk, unarmored, yet resilient. Which, let's be honest, is a beautiful insult. Back in Gaia, the Confederacy strained. Debates broke out between the polities. Should they unite under a single leader? Should they resist together? Or surrender separately? Some envoys even suggested joining Beach instead, trading one problem for another. It was, in many ways, a test of Gaia's very identity. Could a kingdom without a king survive a kingdom with one? You lean against a tree whose roots dig deep into a long-lost wall. The air smells of wet stone and rust. It's quiet here, peaceful, but in your imagination, you hear the hoofbeats again. Not galloping, just steady, methodical, the sound of a larger power moving in. And yet, there's defiance in the silence. Gaia didn't crumble overnight. It endured for generations under pressure, maintaining its culture, its verse, and its salt-lined soul. If anything, its greatest tragedy wasn't being conquered, it was being rewritten. Historians still argue whether Scylla intentionally erased Gaia from official records, or whether it was just a natural side effect of absorbing a poetic, decentralized culture into a bureaucratic, hierarchical one. Either way, the result was the same. Gaia faded, not in flames, but in footnotes. But here, among the wind-chapped stones and the salt-stained air, you remember. You remember a kingdom that stood not with walls, but with words, that chose verse over violence, and that, even in its decline, never forgot to see. The sun dips lower, the hills glow, and somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, a poem whispers on the breeze. The ground beneath your feet shifts slightly. No, not a quake, just a memory echoing under the soil. You're standing now near what was once the western flank of the Gaia Confederacy, close to the disputed borderlands with Scylla. There's no grand battlefield here, no towering monument, just mossy fields and the occasional stone marker someone's probably mistaken for a cow tether. Yet once, this humble landscape bore witness to the closest thing Gaia ever had to a final stand. You'd expect the climax of a kingdom story to come with fanfare, clashing swords, thundering cavalry, maybe a flaming palace or two. But Gaia didn't go out like that. Its last battles were subtle, local, and strangely quiet, like a script that trails off before the last act. One skirmish stands out in the record, though record is generous, since most of what we know comes from Scylla's official history, Samguk Sagi, and the occasional reluctant nod from Chinese envoys. Gaia's own version, lost to time, or simply never written down. Anyway, it's the year 532 CE, and the Gaia polity of Gumguan Gaia, once the most powerful and culturally rich of the Confederation, is losing patience. Scylla has all but surrounded it. Trade routes are severed. Poetry festivals are, well, let's just say attendance has dropped off. Even the ironworks, once the pride of the region, have been disrupted. Enter King Guhi, the final ruler of Gumguan Gaia. He's a man of contradictions. Born into royalty, raised on odes and courtly ceremony, yet increasingly forced to deal with troops, terrain maps, and tribute demands. You picture him now, pacing on a veranda, scribbling stanzas with one hand and holding a war council with the other. And then he gives in, not with a cry of surrender, but with a scroll. Yes, he sends a poem. Well, a diplomatic letter. But its language is so formally poetic it might as well be a farewell sonnet. He formally submits to Scylla, offering peace and integration. He even throws in a symbolic gesture, the royal family's regalia, Ornamental swords, crowns, and records delivered in neat bundles. Historians still argue whether Guy's decision was a brilliant act of preservation or a quiet betrayal. Some say he spared his people from unnecessary bloodshed. Others believe he signed away Gaia's identity under pressure, without broader consent from the rest of the Confederacy. But here's the twist. Not all of Gaia agreed with him. While Gumgwan Gaia bent the knee, other polities, especially the Gaia, resisted. Small-scale conflicts erupted. There was no unified front, no final alliance of Gaia's city-states. Instead, there were isolated defenses, last holds, and tragic miscommunications. One legend, half truth, half bedtime story, tells of a poet scout named Nungsan, who tried to warn a mountain village of a surprise Scylla advance by carving a poem into a tree. By the time the verse was deciphered, the army had already arrived. Whether or not Nungsan ever existed, you can't help but admire the stubbornness. Who sends military warnings in iambic meter? Still, resistance didn't last. By the mid-6th century, all remnants of Gaia had been absorbed or dismantled. The once flourishing salt and iron trade now flowed under Scylla banners. Royal titles were stripped, temples converted, records rewritten, or simply vanished. And yet, this wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. There were few sieges, few reports of mass executions or public enslavement. Gaia didn't burn. It dissolved, erased politely. It's almost more haunting that way. You step over a ridge and find something unexpected. A cluster of burial mounds, gently domed, covered in tall grass. One has been restored by modern archaeologists, revealing the coffin's alignment, the grave goods, a silver comb, some iron tools, and a lacquered wooden cup. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just everyday elegance. This burial site doesn't match Scylla styles. It's older. It's Gaia. What makes it special is the inscription found etched inside the lid. A poem. Short, barely readable, but the meaning's there. We buried you with salt on your lips, to carry flavor into the next life. Tell them we did not vanish. We crystallized. It's the kind of thing that stays with you. Poetry again, outliving politics. Now, let's be honest. Gaia was never a global power. It didn't build pyramids or conquer continents. It was a patchwork of local identities, built on salt, iron, and song. But its disappearance, so slow, so quiet, raises uncomfortable questions. Like, who decides what a kingdom is worth remembering? Historians still debate whether Scylla deliberately suppressed Gaia's memory to strengthen their own legitimacy, or whether Gaia's fading was simply an accidental consequence of integration. Some modern scholars point to how Samguk Sagi barely mentions Gaia, and when it does, it's usually in the context of finally joining Scylla's glorious civilization. But the truth leaks through. In songs, in dialects, in burial sites, in the unearthed tools and ornaments found miles apart, yet strikingly similar. In the oral histories of fishing villages who still season their stews the way their ancestors did, salted, briny, and just a little poetic. So here you are, in the middle of what was once everything, and is now almost nothing. A kingdom that resisted empire not with weapons, but with rhythm, that fought to preserve identity, even if only in metaphor. That surrendered, yes, but in verse. And maybe that's the legacy. Not a climactic battle, but a quiet echo. A kingdom that died with dignity, and just enough rhyme to ensure we'd still be talking about it, whispering it, dreaming it, centuries later. You wander past the burial mounds, letting your fingers brush against the long grass swaying in the wind. Each blade feels like a whisper from another age. The sun's dipping low now, casting a warm gold across the hills, once walked by people whose names history tried to forget. And yet you're here, so maybe it didn't succeed. Gaia's final disappearance wasn't some theatrical collapse. No dramatic betrayal, no smoldering capital, no mass exile. It simply vanished. Gradually, quietly, like fog burning off a lake at dawn. One moment, there are maps marking city-states like Gumgwan, Era, and Digaya. A generation later, they're footnotes, or missing entirely. Scylla absorbed them like water soaking into silk, smooth, efficient. and very hard to undo. This wasn't an enemy conquering a rival. It was more like a bigger neighbor inviting smaller neighbors into their home, then repainting the walls and denying anyone else had ever lived there. You find yourself at the edge of what used to be a salt marsh. It's dry now, long since converted into farmland. But once, this was the economic heartbeat of the region, where Gaia's salt was harvested in crystalline sheets, bundled into clay pots, and traded across the sea. Now, it's cabbage and radish rows. Practical, sure, but a little less poetic. Historians still argue whether Gaia was truly erased or just assimilated. Some claim that Gaia's influence was quietly woven into Silla culture, its ironworking methods, its local rituals, even its love of poetry. Others think the silence was deliberate, part of a systematic campaign to make Silla look like the sole legitimate inheritor of Korea's southern legacy. The official court records of the unified Silla period barely mention Gaia. When they do, it's usually condescending. You get phrases like the barbarous peoples of the South, or those who benefited from the Silla blessing of order. Sounds like a humble brag in historical form. And then there's the twist. Archaeology doesn't lie as politely as royal historians. In the 1990s, Korean archaeologists unearthed lavish Gaia tombs in places the Samguk Sagi claimed were Silla territory. Inside, they found ornate crowns, combs, lacquerware, and foreign trade goods that clearly didn't belong to Silla traditions. And even stranger, some of those burial sites were intact, untouched, undisturbed for over 1,400 years, as if the people who buried their loved ones didn't expect them to be remembered by textbooks, just by the earth. One site near Gimhae revealed something extraordinary. A room-sized tomb with jade ornaments and Japanese-style swords, suggesting Gaia's reach was broader than anyone had guessed. Not just local lords trading fish and salt, but full-scale diplomacy, cultural exchange, maybe even artistic fusion. You step down into a replica of one of those tombs, carefully constructed by modern historians and preservationists. Cool air hugs your arms. The floor is laid with stone panels, and a low alcove holds a faded painting of waves crashing over iron cauldrons. Above the entrance, an inscription in classical Chinese. Roughly translated, it reads, "The tide withdraws, but the salt remains." That's Gaia in one sentence. But even now, after all this digging, literally and figuratively, people still don't agree on what Gaia was. A real kingdom? A loose confederacy? A romantic exaggeration of a half-remembered cluster of tribes? Some fringe scholars even suggest Gaia never existed as a centralized identity at all, that it was invented later, perhaps as a response to nationalism or regional pride. But let's be honest, there's something deeply human in that debate, isn't there? The desire to find roots, claim pride in forgotten things, resurrect what was quietly buried. Modern descendants of the Gaia region, particularly in Gimhae and Goryeo, now hold festivals celebrating Gaia culture. They perform music on Gyeojeom, a traditional 12-string instrument said to have originated from Gaia courts. They wear reproduction crowns, recite old poems, and cook dishes seasoned with brine seaweed and fermented shrimp. It's not political. It's ancestral. A kind of resistance by remembrance. And yet, you feel the tension even in these celebrations. A longing, a need to say we mattered. We were here. You move on, walking along a trail where historians believe trade caravans once passed, short-legged ponies burdened with salt jars, their hooves kicking up dust and verse in equal measure. Merchants back then composed quick poems to pass the time, or to curry favor with village hosts. Some of these verses survive in regional folklore. If you taste the salt and not the grain, you've missed the heart and caught the pain. Cryptic, rhythmic, definitely Gaia. There's a final story you hear whispered on the wind, one last thread from a tapestry that's mostly been unraveled. It tells of a wandering poet, blind and old, who traveled to the capital of Silla with nothing but a staff and a satchel of scrolls. He stood at the palace gates, reciting the history of Gaia from memory, 40 verses, each ending with the same phrase, "And we sang by the sea." The court officials asked who he was. He replied, I am the voice you silenced. And then he left, or disappeared, or turned into a heron and flew over the marsh. Depending on who tells it. Is it true? Probably not, but you want it to be. And maybe that's what matters. Because kingdoms like Gaia don't vanish entirely. They wait, under soil and song, on the tips of tongues daring to speak them again. You take one last look over the plains, the river, the hills still whispering salt poems. And just before the wind shifts, you swear you hear it. And we sang by the sea. You shuffle your feet in the loose dirt, standing where salt caravans once threaded their way toward the coast. And now you start listening. Not with your ears exactly, but with something softer, more alert. You listen for language, for the words that once stitched this world together. Because when a kingdom vanishes, it doesn't take its tongue with it immediately. Language lingers, in lullabies, in insults, in recipes no one remembers how to write down, but still know how to make. And if you know where to look or listen, you might just hear the ghost of Gaia speaking through the cracks. Let's begin with the official version. There's no surviving Gaia language. No grammar textbooks, no stone tablets, no dusty scrolls tucked away in a hidden temple archive with the helpful pronunciation guide. According to mainstream history, Gaia, like many of the minor states of early Korea, never developed a fully distinct written tradition of its own. The dominant writing system across the peninsula was classical Chinese, used by scribes for diplomacy and administration. And Gaia's ruling class, practical as they were poetic, used it too. But spoken language? That's a whole other sea of squid ink. Historians still argue whether Gaia had its own unique tongue, a dialect completely separate from its neighbors, or whether it simply used regional variants of early Korean mixed with loan words from its trading partners. Some linguists propose that the Gaia language may have had strong connections to Japonic languages due to close maritime trade with the Japanese archipelago, particularly the Yamato people. Others think it was closer to Silla-Korean, just with a Salter accent, both literally and metaphorically. You hike uphill to a village where the dialect is still peppered with curious expressions. Old folks say things like turi-turi when they mean bit by bit, or call a child's mischievous look cameo, which doesn't appear in standard Korean. Local linguists don't know where these terms come from, but some believe they're survivals, linguistic fossils buried in the living language. One elderly potter, grinning behind a layer of clay dust, tells you that in his grandmother's time, people whispered phrases at night when the wind blew off the river, phrases the school teachers discouraged, phrases that didn't appear in any books. He recites one slowly. Sangje Gori Wa Jiamun Bamsi. It loosely translates to, the salt path is bright, the night crow darker still. Poetic, vaguely spooky, and totally untraceable in any modern linguistic archive. You scribble it down in your head, because some things don't survive unless someone bothers to remember them. In rural schools, some educators have begun incorporating these dialect remnants into heritage units, teaching kids that their grandparents' strange turns of phrase might actually be the last embers of a language snuffed out before it ever had a name. It's both exciting and melancholy, like finding a footprint that leads nowhere. Fringe scholars, usually the kind with one too many coffee-stained notebooks, have tried to reconstruct Gaia's spoken tongue from scratch. They comb through trade records, tomb inscriptions, and modern dialect surveys, trying to reverse engineer the phonetics of a language that left no audio recordings. One even proposed that certain patterns in Gaia burial poetry hint at a 5-tone pitch system, similar to early Chinese tonal languages. Most mainstream linguists raise an eyebrow. Some raise both. Still, you can't help but feel there's something true in the sound of those forgotten syllables. Not scientifically proven, maybe, but emotionally resonant, like the hush of waves, or the rustle of paper-thin crab shells left behind by a departing tide. A stranger theory floats through your mind, one you heard whispered over barley tea at a museum cafe. It goes like this. Gaia's language didn't die, it simply hid. It went underground, not in caves, but in kitchens and fish markets, passed down as rhythms and recipes. Maybe the odd word for eel paste, or fermented squid guts, is older than Scylla itself. And why not? Salt preserves things, including words. Some modern musicians have taken this idea and run with it. You watch a young performer on a low-lit stage pluck the strings of a Gaegeum, singing verses that don't match any known language. She calls it reconstructed Gaia. It's part performance art, part tribute, part dreamy speculation. The audience sways with her, half asleep, half believing. Elsewhere, graffiti on a weathered seawall reads, in red brushwork, Jirani and El Bojima. No one agrees what it means. Locals say it's an old lover's phrase. One linguist insists it could mean salt first, eyes closed. Whatever that means, you find yourself mouthing the words anyway. Gaia's supposed linguistic extinction turns out to be more of a slow fade than a sudden blackout. The poetry survived longer. Oral verses, remembered generations after the ink was gone, began surfacing in folktales collected during the 19th and 20th centuries. Some share curious cadence, lines echoing older Japanese waka, others in formats we associate more with shamanic chant or farming work songs. One poem, barely a few lines long, is scratched onto a roof tile discovered at a former Gaia stronghold. Salt in my bowl, iron in my hands, song in my mouth. This is enough. You let those words rest in your chest. They don't demand anything. They just are. Language doesn't need permanence to matter. Sometimes, surviving as a whisper is more impressive than living in stone. And as you step away from the slope, you wonder how many more kingdoms spoke like this, softly, sideways, without ever being taught to scream. You crouch in the river mud, just outside a construction site that was supposed to be a parking garage, and ended up being a portal to the past. Here, beneath layers of silt and brine, the bones of Gaia still whisper, if you're patient enough to hear them. It's the early 1990s, and a backhoe hit something unexpected. Not a pipe, not rock, but a wall. Not just any wall. A stone-lined chamber, rectangular, clean, and deliberate. Archaeologists arrive, hard hats replaced by hushed voices. The site, Dizongdong in Gimhe. The find, one of the most significant tomb clusters in Korean history. And somehow, the salt air feels reverent. Inside the chambers, they find skeletons curled like commas. Crown-shaped ornaments made of gold, silver, and bronze. Weapons too delicate for battle, but perfect for prestige. And pottery. Oh, so much pottery. Like a quiet army of ghosts waiting for dinner to start. Historians still argue whether these burial items reflect purely Gaia tradition, or if they represent an elite class heavily influenced by neighboring Scylla. Some claim the crowns show a clear Scylla aesthetic, tall, tree-like structures with antler-like protrusions. Others insist the designs predate those of Scylla entirely. The debate gets louder every year, and the diggers keep digging. But let's slow down. You brush away some soil. What you're looking at isn't just a grave. It's a declaration. A silent one, sure, but not subtle. These tombs are saying, we mattered. We were here. You just forgot. And then come the teeth. Human remains, shockingly well preserved for their age. Scientists take samples, test the enamel, and find trace elements of marine life. Oysters, anchovies, salted mackerel. You imagine someone from 1,500 years ago smiling wide, sea salt breath thick in the air. One particularly well-preserved skeleton bears a curious sign. Signs of arthritis in the knees, calluses on the femurs, and flattened vertebrae. An ironworker, most likely. You wonder if his tools were buried nearby. If he sang while he worked. If he ever recited poetry to molten metal, just because he could. Some of the burial jars are even stranger. For infants, archaeologists uncover round clay jars, tiny, simple, heartbreaking. Babies, wrapped in linen, curled in ceramic, nestled as though the world had just forgotten to keep them. The jars vary in shape and decoration, but the purpose is always the same, to return the youngest to the earth gently. Local legends once claimed these jars held pickled fish. Turns out, the truth is more human and more haunting. In another chamber, researchers discover a perfectly intact wooden coffin inside a stone tomb, preserved thanks to a waterlogged environment that kept oxygen at bay. Inside, a woman, tall, elegant, her bones wearing fragments of silk and bronze. They call her the Lady of Gaia. No one knows her name, but her jewelry speaks louder than any scroll. She wore prestige like perfume. One quirky tidbit comes from her burial: the inclusion of a lacquered box filled with what might have been cosmetics or ritual pigments. Alongside it, a thin bronze needle. A historian jokes that even in death, she wouldn't skip her morning routine. You walk past a display case in a nearby museum where this woman's replica coffin rests under soft lighting. Nearby school children scribble notes. One points and whispers, "She looks like a queen." Another replies, "She probably wrote poems." Meanwhile, ongoing digs in places like Songyin and Yangtze reveal more tombs, some older, some newer. One site uncovers evidence of sacrificial burials, secondary skeletons buried alongside the primary one, positioned awkwardly, clearly not honored. Theories abound: retainers, concubines, prisoners. Historians can't agree, but the tone shifts. Gaia may have loved its poetry, but death was no romantic affair. Salted soil preserves bones better than most expect. The irony: Gaia's greatest economic export, salt, may also be the reason we still have pieces of it today. In one site, an archaeologist comments that the remains smell faintly metallic, with a tang that clings to your nose hairs. Like rusted seaweed, he says. You decide not to ask how he knows that. And here's something unexpected. In recent years, radar scans detect structures beneath farmland once believed to be untouched. Temples, homes, kills. It's unclear, but it suggests that the Gaia landscape was far more complex than the simple confederation of villages described in older textbooks. It had zones, hierarchies, infrastructure. One fringe theory even posits that Gaia pioneered a rudimentary sewage system in some settlements, with salt water used as a cleansing agent. There's no definitive proof, but the idea of briny sanitation tickles the imagination. Clean enough to eat off the floor. One researcher jokes, if the fish don't beat you to it. Tourism has picked up around these ancient sites, but not in the flashy, neon-lit way you might expect. Most visitors come quietly, respectfully. Many light incense. A few even read poems aloud in the reconstructed plazas. Somewhere you think, the spirit of that poetry-loving blacksmith is smiling. Not everything unearthed can be interpreted with certainty. A recent dig reveals a set of iron implements no one can identify. Not farming tools, not weapons, not decorative. They resemble stylized fish hooks, but there's no clear use. Theories range from fishing gear to ritual objects to an early attempt at orthopedic braces. For now, they remain a mystery, displayed under the label, function unknown, which, let's be honest, might be the most honest label in any museum. You run your fingers along the glass case, wishing you could ask just one question, just one, and get an answer. But Gaia doesn't answer quickly. It replies in fragments. A chipped comb, a child's footprint in clay, a scratch in a pot's glaze that might just be someone's name. And so, archaeologists keep digging. Not for treasure exactly, not even for answers, just for voices. And Gaia, silent for centuries, is beginning, slowly, patiently, to speak again. You return to the salt-swept shoreline one last time. The wind carries brine and the distant rhythm of waves, like a heartbeat long forgotten. Gaia isn't gone. It's simply quiet, lying beneath centuries of soil, poetry, and selective memory. You're standing where the tide laps over buried ruins. This is where history frayed, not with a final battle or a dramatic collapse, but with something more unsettling, a soft, gradual absorption. No fires, no screams, just silence, ink, and erasure. By the late 500s EE, Scylla had grown too large to ignore. Gaia's once loyal city-states began to break away, wooed by promises or coerced by spears. The Confederacy, never centralized, couldn't rally under one leader. It lacked the hierarchy Scylla excelled at, the gears and levers of a proper state machine. And so, one by one, the Gaia polities folded into the growing Scylla Empire. Gumgwan Gaia, the most prominent, fell in 532 CE. Its ruler, King Guhi, didn't go down with fire but surrendered peacefully. He was given a title, land, and the illusion of dignity. Historians still argue whether this was compassion or clever imperial PR. Did Guhi choose peace to save his people, or was he left with no choice at all? You wander through the remnants of a palace that no longer exists, trying to imagine the last few days. The hurried meetings, the resigned poets, the salted fish, uneaten on wooden trays. No one records the final Gaia poem. If it existed, it's lost to tide and time. The strange part, Gaia wasn't demonized like some fallen kingdoms. It was just forgotten. Scylla scribes controlled the narrative and focused their ink elsewhere. Later dynasties ignored Gaia entirely, preferring neat, linear histories that made sense. Gaia didn't fit. It was too fragmented, too poetic, too inconvenient. For over 1,000 years, Gaia lived in a fog of omission. But you can still find it, if you know where to look. Linguists trace certain words in Southern Korean dialects back to Gaia roots. A way of saying moon, a term for grandmother, a verb that means to mend fishing nets. They don't show up in standard Korean, but survive in village conversations, whispered like a lullaby with salt still clinging to the edges. In tiny local festivals, especially near Gimhae and Namhae, elders sing songs no one can trace, rhythms that don't match Scylla court music. Dances performed in spiral patterns, not rows. Are these remnants of Gaia ritual, or just folk inventions grafted onto a hungry past? There's one festival where children write poems in chalk on seashells and throw them into the ocean. No one knows when the tradition started. Some say it's to honor sea gods. Others believe it's for lost souls. But when asked, a grandmother simply shrugs and says, "It's what our grandmothers did." Modern South Korea has slowly begun to reclaim Gaia's story. Museums now feature dedicated Gaia halls. Schools mention its poetry and metallurgy alongside the big three kingdoms. In 2023, a campaign launched to seek UNESCO recognition for Gaia's heritage sites. One politician, trying too hard to be hip, called it Gaia's rebranding. You roll your eyes, but you get it. History, like poetry, needs a stage. Archaeologists keep uncovering tombs, more artifacts, more questions. Some finds suggest trade routes went further than expected, perhaps even to the Ryukyu Islands or Southeast Asia. The idea of Gaia as a salt and iron superconnector is growing. One quirky discovery from 2021, a large stone basin with salt incrustations and faint lines etched inside, likely a tally system for production quotas. Think ancient Excel spreadsheet, but crunchier. The debate about whether Gaia was a kingdom, a confederacy, or something else entirely continues. Some scholars argue that even calling it Gaia is misleading. It may have never called itself that. Maybe it was just what outsiders labeled the region. But names aren't everything. You can feel Gaia most in the places the guidebooks skip. In a salty breeze off a fishing boat. In the glint of iron tools in an old blacksmith stall. In a forgotten stanza sung by an old man while getting anchovies. And yes, in the poetry. Lines discovered etched into pottery shards. Fragments that don't rhyme. Verses about fog, hunger, salt, and longing. One broken piece simply reads, "She turned to the sea, and it did not turn back." The museums have put it behind glass, with a translation and a long label. But you think the poet wouldn't have cared about display cases. They just wanted the words to survive. And survive they did. So now you ease back. The salt wind grows softer. The waves slow. The night stretches out like a long linen sheet. Warm, weighted, comforting. You've walked through a kingdom that few remember, where poetry whispered louder than conquest, and salt was more valuable than gold. Maybe you feel it in your chest now. That grain of longing. That quiet ache for something gentle, lost, and oddly beautiful. Gaia wasn't loud. It didn't go down in fire or rebellion. It faded like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind only traces. A pot, a poem, a whisper. Your breath settles. You imagine the last poet of Gaia sitting by a brazier, composing verse by lamplight while the Confederacy unraveled behind him. Maybe he knew the end was near. Maybe he didn't care. He just wrote, because that's what they did. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts slow. Let the poetry of salt and iron drift behind your eyes. There's no need to understand every detail. Gaia doesn't demand comprehension, only attention, only stillness. And now, as your limbs grow heavy and the world hushes around you, remember, not all kingdoms are meant to conquer. Some are meant to be remembered slowly, quietly, like the aftertaste of sea breeze, or a half-remembered poem. Sleep well, traveler.